person who did all of this work and that we're here to honor. So first I wanted to say personal things, and I'll read the actual thing that she sent. But I'm just really extremely proud of Olivia. She's been an incredible activist and organizer, has opened many people's eyes to different struggles, especially around the Latinx population, as well as ICE and immigration. And I think focusing efforts across Colorado Springs to really support our communities. She is super hardworking. She's an amazing kickboxer. And it's been incredible to see your strength, not only personally, but professionally, as well as academically. You've put so much time and effort into this. I know very specifically the work that had to go into this, and talking about Colorado Springs, talking about activism. So I'm so glad to know you in so many different facets, and I'm just so proud of all of the work that you have done, and that all of this is for you. So I hope throughout all of this, you can take moments to really reflect on just like the deep connection to the community that you have, the way people support, love, and care for you, because it is literally right here, right now. People walking in. It is all for you. Just want you to know. So, Olivia Romero, she, her, and hers is a Latinx and Indigenous descent, born and raised in Colorado Springs. She's in her final semester as a graduate student in the sociology department of UCCS. Yeah, woo! Her research interests are social movements with an emphasis on racial justice and intersectionality, such as Black Lives Matter, immigrants' rights, Indigenous peoples' rights. Her thesis work is on activist experiences in Colorado Springs, including motivations for doing social justice work, barriers to participation, the impact of COVID-19, and experiences with the police. She has been an activist for 10 plus years and the co-founder of Pikes Peak Women for Liberation, a grassroots organization that focuses on uplifting Black, Indigenous, and women of color, as well as other marginalized genders with an intersectional approach. Please give the biggest round of applause to Olivia!
Thank you so much. I wanted to start by acknowledging the Indigenous land that we are on. I am grateful to be a guest on the unceded territory of the Ute peoples. The earliest documented peoples also include the Apache, Arapaho, Comanche, and Cheyenne. I would also like to dedicate my thesis work to my mother, who passed in December 2018, to Iggy Igloo, who left this plane of existence to be with his ancestors just this summer, and of course the activists that shared their stories, as this work would not be possible without them, and of course the other badass human beings doing incredible work in the city. Thank you all. So my research. I analyzed the experiences of 23 different social justice activists here in Colorado Springs. This started out really as me trying to figure out where I fit in the ivory tower. As a Latinx Indigenous woman, it is very daunting, as many have experienced. You know, this space is built for white elite men, and it's not built for us. So there are many struggles that are part of that, existing in that space. Including just continuing on with higher education. So graduate school particularly emphasizes doing research. Okay, so what does that mean? I started my second year, hi Bunny, in the grad program, just really not knowing what I wanted to do, just being really cognizant of the research process and how exploitive it can be. Being an advocate for many marginalized identities, particularly here in Colorado Springs, I really had to sit with that and reflect on who I was and who I could even be to do that research. So I'm an advocate for people that experience homelessness, and that was originally an interest of mine. I really just wanted to share the stories of literally my neighbors that are experiencing homelessness. And it just started to feel really yucky. I myself have never experienced homelessness. I know we can all say that we are just a paycheck away from experiencing homelessness, which is very true for some of us, but I'm very fortunate to have a supportive family and a supportive community to where I would not be left out on the streets. So it just didn't feel right to continue on with that type of research. So I really had to figure out, okay, here I am in this program, like I already started, I gotta finish, what do I do? So again, just coming from undergrad, we are taught these very white, hegemonic ways of thinking that are really focused on, you have to be unbiased in the research that you do. You can't have any connections to the research that you do. And it was really just like, I can't do that. I'm a human being with passion, and of course I'm gonna have some sort of connection to the research that I do. So I was fortunate to take a class with my mentor, Eduardo Portillos, and he had faith in me to do the research that I wanted to do, which was on activism. I figured it out, like what can I do? What am I a part of? Okay, well, I'm an activist. There are stories that need to be told. Can I just interview activists about their experiences in Colorado Springs? And he told me, of course, like why wouldn't you? You would be the person to do that. So that's how the research started. I reached out to many of you that are in this crowd, just through the activist work that we've done together to see like, hey, would you like to, talk about your experiences? And I'm very grateful that some of you did want to share those experiences with me. It also involved just you knowing other people, like, oh, I know this person, maybe they'd want to talk to you. So that was helpful as well. As far as the focus, it was really just pretty casual. I had, interview questions prepared that I asked, but it was really just a conversation, which was very important for me in the research, because I feel like a lot of the time we are in these spaces and we're only doing the work. We don't get to know who we are as a community, particularly in activist work, because it's always doing the work. We don't get to talk about our experiences. We don't get to talk about our struggles. We don't get to talk about how we manage them. And that was really important for me to uncover that. So it really just came down to looking at all of those interviews, all 23 that I was able to conduct, and finding, okay, so what did I find here? What can I present back to the community? And it came down to, of course, the motivations for participation, the barriers and obstacles, and then unfortunately in the middle of conducting interviews we had a big hit with COVID-19, so that really put a lot of things on hold, but it also added to the stories that I was able to share, because it obviously impacted the activist work that we are able to do. Also, just wanted to note sort of how I came about this research, with, again, my positionality as a student at the university, just really realizing that disconnect between what we're learning about in the classroom and what's actually happening. So particularly social movements, like that was a huge interest of mine to study, but we were really only learning about like 1960s civil rights movements. Like that's cool, but it's so much different now that we need to be hearing the stories of activists doing the work now, because we live in very different times with very different struggles that we are combating. So I set out to do that work. So what did I find? For motivations, many activists actually viewed that their identity sort of not forced, but is just a part of activism. For example, some shared that just existing as a woman of color in a space is in itself activism. Just taking up space as a woman of color is activism, because there are so many spaces that we are not meant to take up space. There were others that sort of talked about this like, yeah, I could see that, but really it has to be more than that. It has to be more than just your identity. It has to be you actually going out and doing something to enact change. Some share that activism runs in their family. For many, it was either growing up in a family of social workers, that this is just what I'm used to, this is what I'm taught. You just stick up for people, you advocate for people, and that gives my life purpose. Others come from a very different background in their family, where it was expected that you would go out and you would protest and you would get arrested. That was just a family expectation. There are also stories about how some got involved because of politics, largely around Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign. So these activists had, some of the ideas of what it meant to stand up for what was right, but it was really Bernie Sanders and that his campaign and message that really pushed people to become active. And then lastly, a part of the motivations was COVID-19. So a quote that I took from one of my interviews with a Black man was, "COVID ain't killing us faster than the police." So this became like a central focus, because last summer we had the murder of George Floyd, and some of us were able to protest in the streets and some of us weren't, either because we were at risk personally or we didn't want to put our families at risk. But there were individuals that took that risk because COVID ain't killing us faster than the police. So that really became part of the motivator, like, yeah, there's this risk, but we really need to be out there. So sort of weighing, those options. There was also, because so many people were impacted, either because their work, they lost work, they were working from home, so they no longer had to commute, 2 to 4 hours a day. So that adds 2 to 4 hours a day that you're able to actually pay the fuck attention. So people were paying attention. Okay, it's not just a fleeting headline, like something's going on. Also, because of the work that people lost, they were actually able to protest, which has been an issue, just accessibility. I know in my very early stages of organizing here in Colorado Springs, that's always been like a frustration. Like, we organized this great protest, where is everyone? And then really over the years being able to reflect on that, like, okay, maybe it's just not accessible to everyone. Not everyone can show up. Not everyone has the time off of work. Not everyone has like a Monday through Friday job to where they can show up at City Hall on a Saturday, where it doesn't make sense to show up at City Hall on a Saturday anyway. But so we have all of these barriers, but the, impact that COVID-19 sort of lessened those barriers and allowed people to participate in ways that they were not able to participate before. And then again, just absorbing what is going on. I think so many people were experiencing, the marginalization, the oppression that many groups have experienced because of COVID-19, and really realized the importance of things like universal health care, job equality, and also access to food. Those are all things that have existed prior to COVID-19, but it really just put it on the forefront that, hey, these are things that we need to be working for, and not just during a global pandemic. Another section of my research was about the obstacles and risk to participation. So factionalism was a huge piece of this. If I had known going into the research that pretty much all of my interviews would have talked about the factionalism or the infighting, the disagreements, I would have focused only on factionalism, just because it's so important. We talk about, there's strength in numbers, like we need to be working together, but it doesn't happen. Just my own personal observations, and I know probably 99.9% of you here can agree that like we can't agree on anything. Although we can agree on like bigger things like Black Lives Matter, we can agree on, you know, like affordable housing, but we can't agree on how we get there. Another huge piece of this was not just factionalism, but factionalism and race. So this came up particularly with different social movement groups that have exhibited things such as anti-Blackness, that have pushed people away from either organizing with those specific groups or have pushed them away from organizing as a whole. So this is something that has also not been addressed in social movement spaces here in Colorado Springs. This is a pretty significant part of the research because of the oppression that Black, Indigenous, and people of color experience outside of activism, that when compounded with the oppression they experience in activist spaces, it leads to burnout. And when we talk about burnout, what we're really talking about is like, this is the reason why we're unable to sustain that participation. We're not addressing these issues that are pushing people out. How can we expect to keep people involved if there's constant anti-Blackness, there's racism, there's sexism, there's misogyny, all of these things that are being, you know, pushed under the rug because like, oh, they're such a great organizer. No, we still need to address that. There's also the importance of race-related stress, particularly at protests that escalated to state violence with Colorado Springs Police Department. There were examples of protests where people showed up under the impression that it was going to be a different type of event, and then it ended up escalating. So that put marginalized people at risk because they weren't expecting it, and also we have newer or younger or just people that haven't, you know, been involved in those more agitative tactics, that they don't know what to do when the police show up. They don't know what to do when they're arrested or cited. They don't know who to talk to, who not to talk to. So those are all issues that got brought up that need to be addressed. And then also the issue of activists not being able to share fear. So we're all, you know, we all want to be these superheroes and show like we're fearless, we don't care about anything, but there's a legit fear, and we need to have spaces that acknowledge that and also allow that to be shown. And then more on the factionalism, just with strained interpersonal relationships. Several activists shared stories about how they had to cut ties with their family, friends, or coworkers. And some activists did this particularly because they feared that their job might be at risk. So I myself personally have been very fortunate to have a job kind of knows my level of activism, but I would never be in the position to where my boss would fire me because of what I do. There was also stories about parenting and whether that was an obstacle or not. A lot of the literature that I looked at in doing this study talked about parenting, particularly with the age of children that are at home. So it looked at, is age of children at home a barrier, such as having children under the age of 12, because what do? Do you bring your children with you? Can you find childcare? All of these things. So I really looked at that as far as the activists that are parents that I interviewed, and it really didn't come up as significant. What did come up as significant was the type of activism or the level of activism. So there's something very different from, you know, showing up to the steps in City Hall and blocking a street. So that really changed like the different types of activism that people were able to participate in based on the age of their children at home. And then also I brought it back to COVID-19 as a barrier. So I originally thought like this would come up more as an obstacle that just stopped people from participating. But what really came out of it was that it was more of a barrier because people were still doing the work. They were doing the work from home because we were all forced to, right? We couldn't just stop going to work. They found a way for us to use technology and do the draining screen thing that many of us are still doing. And this, again, was very significant because it addressed the accessibility issue, again, with people being able to be involved. I'm sure there are people that wanted to attend tonight that couldn't be here either because of transportation, childcare, various things. So although a global pandemic shouldn't have happened, for access to happen, it did. So it showed us ways to make events more accessible, make different options for people to participate. And it also really opened up a community for people to share knowledge, which was very important. I know that Twitter has been huge just with activism, sharing live videos, really getting like the real story out and not just something you hear on like Fox News. People were actually able to see like, no, this is what happened versus what someone else said and a distorted narrative. Lastly, I focused on suppressing protest. So this came from my own personal experience. Last summer, I was falsely accused of being at the I-25 protest. For those of you that are unaware, there were some individuals that blocked I-25, I think it was the end of June last year, protesting the police killing of Elijah McClain. I got a phone call early July from a Colorado Springs Police Department detective saying I was there, saying that they had video evidence that I was there, demanded an explanation for the protest. I never encountered anything like that in my life. I have been to a number of protests with varying different, levels of participation as far as being agitative and whatnot, but I wasn't there. So it was really a daunting experience because I had been at home most of the summer, because of COVID-19. I was also still doing grad classes and I was TAing. I was grading every single day, but it started making me question my sanity. I was gaslit by the Colorado Springs Police Department. I legitimately thought maybe I was there. Maybe COVID-19 really got to me. Maybe I forgot that I was there. Like, how did this happen? So I spent the rest of 24 hours or so just really racking my brain. Like, what did I do that night? Where was I? Did I go to the grocery store? Do I have like a charge on my debit card showing that I was at the grocery store during that time? But because of the monotony and how mundane my summer was, because I was literally I worked from home. I graded, for the sociology class that I was TAing for from home. I didn't really have any other thing that I would have been a part of outside of that routine. So I really, just kind of had to sit with it. Well, this is it. And it really made me realize that my experience isn't even a small percentage of the experience of people that are currently serving time for crimes that they were falsely accused of. And that is a problem. I experienced this turmoil for 24 hours, and I can't imagine being falsely accused of doing something. So I ended up finding out a way to prove, that I was grading that night. Luckily there was, a track of me grading, had my name, and I had a UCCS professor that was going to prove it for me. So I was set, but it was still, those charges were still pending because CSPD was set that I was there. they had video evidence that I was there. So really, I think that sort of like tore me up, because if I had been there, that just would have sucked. I would have, you know, taken the charges and it would have been like, okay, whatever. But just being falsely accused really sucked. So that added to, I might have to take a break for the train, added to the research, because I really wanted to take a break. Okay, I think we're good. So I really wanted to uncover the experiences of other activists that had experienced anything with the police. So I was able to reach out to a few activists that I had already interviewed about their general experiences, and they were able to share with me specific stories about when they were either cited or arrested for protesting. So this ended up being an additional 5 interviews, which I wish had been more, but due to the nature of being, you know, cited or arrested for protesting, I don't blame anyone for not wanting to speak with me. I think it was very brave of the individuals that did, particularly those that were pending charges, just because I probably wouldn't trust anyone to share those stories with. So that was definitely a barrier to getting those stories. Because many that had been arrested last summer are honestly still pending their charges. They haven't even gone to trial. So this part of the research really focused on, I guess, the intent of the Colorado Springs Police Department in suppressing protest. What was their goal? What did they intend to get out of it? So based on the stories that activists shared with me, and then also based on my observations, because I had been in attendance at some of these protests, the Colorado Springs Police Department undoubtedly targeted people that they perceived either as leaders or perceived leaders of protests. So this was either based on, you know, them leading chants. Maybe they are often known as, you know, leading events, emceeing events. Also looking at like the colors and the type of clothes and like the flags and everything that activists wear. So there was one protest particularly, we had gathered outside of the World Arena in February of 2020 to protest the Trump rally that was here in town. There was a small group of us that were kind of fed up with the liberalism that takes place in activism, just, you know, staying on the sidewalk, holding your picket signs. Like, okay, that's great for, you know, creating awareness and creating this sense of like solidarity with other people that look like you, but what are you actually doing when you're doing that? How are you enacting change? So the small group of us that organized were wanting to do something more agitated, and that involved doing things like being in the street, which is frowned upon, you know, like we shouldn't be in the street, like it's unsafe, it's breaking the law, whatever. But really the, I guess, mentality that many of us had is like these are our streets, like who pays for these streets? Like why can't I be in these streets? So of course that always comes with backlash from the police, because they are more concerned with arresting people and citing them and giving them outrageous charges and fines than they are with actually protecting and serving. So again, back to the individuals that were targeted, they were targeted based on either having flags, red or black flags particularly, which can be associated with like socialism or communism or anarchism. So there was really the tactics that they used to identify people, I theorize that it was used in the same ways that police departments target and identify gang members. And what does this mean? So what does this mean when you're targeting only these groups of people? Obviously, you're only targeting activists, but at that protest outside of the Trump rally, Trump supporters were being just as agitative or more agitative than some of us, but none of them were forcefully, taken down by 6 police officers in SWAT gear. Why is that? Another piece of this also focused on preferential and differential treatment that some activists experienced with being arrested or cited for protesting. So there were activists that were arrested or cited for engaging in certain agitative acts that received completely different charges than one another. That is a huge aspect of the unfair and unequal treatment that Colorado Springs Police Department engages in. So there was one example of an activist that received a lighter sentence than their comrade because they went through a different court system. So different court systems will delve out different charges. There was another activist that was allegedly involved in the I-25 protest that received a phone call from the Colorado Springs Police Department letting her know that she was being cited, whereas others, such as myself, had several police officers, several police vehicles show up at our homes, which is a form of public shaming. Something that came up that I sort of wanted to bring out, just as I feel like we should discuss this as an activist community as part of my defense, was really the culture of policing and what police officers view as criminal versus legal, and the discussion of no good apples. So it was asked of me, like, what's the solution? Like, are you suggesting that protesters not be arrested? Well, like, obviously, yeah, duh, but like, is that gonna happen? I don't know. To the level that the Colorado Springs Police Department has focused so highly on protests is, like, why? There's a very real concern when we have people in Southeast Colorado Springs that call the police for help, for service, and they never get that help or service. Why is that happening? Why is it that those efforts are completely diminished from certain areas in Colorado Springs, yet if they have the inkling of like a protest that's going to occur, they're already on scene before the organizers even get there. They are ready to suppress and arrest us and put it to an end. Why is that? So to answer this, I theorize that it's to obviously make a profit through court fees, community service fees, etc. And it's also worth noting the irony that many of the activists that have been cited and told that they need to complete community service already do this as part of their activism. So to specifically target people and then just charge them like it's all about the money. And I think it's really corrupt that we're charging or making people pay to do the work that they're already doing. And then also there's the issue of silencing the voices of racial justice activists because their efforts for justice are a threat to the white ruling class. So not just white supremacy, but capitalism. So that is like the underlying effort. We're likely not going to see the same protest suppression for far right protests because like they're just being American. They're doing their whatever. But if you're challenging a system, if you're actively challenging and demanding that it changes, that's obviously a threat, right, to the way that things are and the way that they want things to be maintained. So ending, there were obviously some limitations to my research. Obviously, I was unable to interview every single activist in Colorado Springs. I would love to, but that would probably take my entire life. And then again, as I had previously mentioned, there are individuals that have been cited or arrested for protesting that did not feel comfortable being interviewed, which I 100% respect, but that is a limitation because I didn't get to hear those experiences. Also, as I mentioned, factionalism, that was a limitation to my research because of factionalism that I have experienced either by engaging in or just experiencing. So there were activists that I intentionally did not reach out to, as I'm sure there were activists that knew about my research but probably didn't want to be researched or interviewed for the factionalism that has occurred in the Colorado Springs activist community. Also, many of the events, as I explained, that I had attended, that some of the activists shared in their interviews. Obviously, I'm not a mind reader and I can't predict the future, so I didn't know that they would be sharing these experiences, but my ability to recall 100% by memory what happened at these events was a limitation. And then obviously COVID-19, as I mentioned, it put a hold on me being able to conduct additional interviews for a while, and then in-person interviews as the Institutional Review Board put a halt on that. That was not allowed while I was completing interviews. And then it also stopped me from being able to attend many in-person events. So the last part about my thesis work includes policy recommendations. So I open this up sort of as questions to y'all. Would it be worth having policymakers and law enforcement listen to the grievances of activists and make an effort to make institutional change, or are we beyond that? I suggest no more performative coffee with a cop events because at-risk communities don't want to go to those events in the first place. We don't trust y'all. Why are we going to go to an event that you organized? There's also the issue of these events. Why do they not show up when we invite them? I've seen many community events organized to have these open dialogue discussions where Colorado Springs Police Department, the chief, the sheriff, city council members are all invited and they don't show up. They only show up when it's on their terms. Obviously, alternatives to law enforcement was defunding the police, more in-depth de-escalation training, no more use of guns or tear gas, especially at protests. And then just the question of would it be worth having the Colorado Springs Police Department walk in our shoes? Do they know about or do they even care about the issues that we're protesting, or is that's just the culture, they don't care? And then I would like to say that all of these efforts would change the perceptions that the activist community, particularly, racial justice activists, have of the police, but I don't think that it will. I don't think that our perceptions are going to change no matter how involved they try to be. And then lastly, I just suggest from the interviews and the concerns that many activists shared just about the training that we need as activists. Social movement groups should provide more trainings for individuals that are new to activism. So this includes what to do in the event that a protest escalates to state violence. And then also, which I feel is super important, how to learn about and manage the hardships and barriers involved with activism and how to overcome them. For my experience, and maybe I'm just not in that space, maybe it exists and I don't know about it, but my experience is that these spaces don't exist, that we don't have a space where we're able to reflect on that and unpack that. And then I just wanted to open it up with any suggestions, comments, or questions from y'all.
But how can we fix that? Is there a way to fix that?
I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the big question, and that's the big question that I think we all have, because it is there's so much emotional labor that goes into all of it, right? Because there are many of us that are bringing up these issues, that are saying like, hey, this person was problematic and continues to be problematic, but you're still organizing with them. These are not safe spaces for us to be in because this is happening, but there isn't an effort to bridge that at all. I'm sure many of you all have observed as well. So I don't know what the solution is, and I think that as a greater activist community, we need to come together and find that. Ashley?
Yeah, I really appreciated the conversation about fear, because I think there's a lot of don't feel things, just push past, but we are human beings and we are afraid, and it doesn't mean you're a better or worse activist if you are also afraid. That's what bodies do. But it made me think about the mental health of activists, and that it takes a toll. People are being re-traumatized or traumatized or in these situations. So did you get any information about mental health and how folks were doing, or if that is a cause of the burnout, because folks are just mentally done or can't do this work? Because there's not a lot of older elders who are doing disruptive work, and I wonder if that's because there's a point where you're I just can't use this very specific trauma anymore.
It wasn't brought up as much as it should have been, but again, it was just a very broad study. A comment that I received from one of my committee members was that this should have been a book and should be a book. So that, well, thank you. But that would just be one thing that needs to be focused on. Absolutely. We are not addressing that. I think many of us just don't even know how to address that because we want to put, these capes on that we are fearless, that we don't go into these spaces fearing for our lives, because if we even express that, then our credibility as a radical activist is somehow diminished. So I think that's definitely something that needs to be addressed, and I hope that we can create more spaces. But then, of course, that is the accessibility thing. Not everyone has access to a therapist or whatever they may need to, manage those situations. Any other questions, comments, suggestions? Yes?
One of the things that I never saw addressed or heard addressed was the fact that there are a lot of people who get into the group and get targeted by people who are in the group. Any idea how part of the training can be to fix some of that?
Can you be a little more specific?
I've seen, for example, there were a couple men who were targeting women who got into the movement and became dangerous in some ways. And so is that something that you had come up at all when you were going through it?
Not specifically, but that goes along with how are we perpetuating white supremacy and dominance and hyper masculinity in these spaces? It's happening. We can have performative wokeness all we want and say that we are intersectional and that we're doing the work to address all of these things, but it's really more than just saying you're doing those things. Like, what are you doing actively to change those things? Again, that just goes back to culture. We are obviously in a white male-dominated society where whiteness is supreme, maleness is supreme. So whether these individuals portraying, this violence are part of those identities or not, it is very embedded in the culture, just because we all have some internalized racism. We all have some internalized misogyny. We are perpetuating it in ways that we don't realize, but until we start to do the work to unlearn and to stop perpetuating it, it's just going to continue to happen. Yeah. That's a good question. So I really liked this part of my research just because it really started with a question. Like, what is activism to you? Like, that was like the first question that I really asked people, aside from like, what's your name? What name do you want me to use? How old are you? Like, things like that. And it really just allowed activists to define activism to them, which I feel is very important, because I shouldn't be the one to be like, no, this is activism. What you said is activism isn't activism. So my view or definition of activism is that it is fluid. There is no one type of activism. You can engage in various different things and be an activist. I forgot to mention that a large part of why I wanted to collaborate with CC Mobile Arts was because art came up a lot in the activist stories, particularly how activists use art either as like a coping mechanism or just in ways to do activism. I've had many conversations with musicians, particularly that have like shared stories of like admiration, like, oh, it's so cool, Olivia, that you go to these protests. I wish I could do that. And I've had to like talk with them and be like, hey, what you're doing is actually really important. Like, you're writing these awesome songs that is getting the message out in a different way that people aren't resistant towards. Like, I know that my presentation, for example, was probably boring at times, and for that I apologize. But that's like what I enjoy about the arts as well, and what I've been able to get out of the art community, particularly poetry and Poetry 719. We do stuff, is like having an outlet for me to share what I've learned, like in an inaccessible place such as a university, and change that into art by sharing spoken word poetry. So again, it's just very fluid, and I think that that needs to be shared more, that like whatever you do, however you do activism is activism, and the policing of activism is problematic, particularly in spaces where we say fuck the police. You're gonna police the way that I do things. So I hope that answers your question. Anyone else? Thank y'all. Oh my gosh. Give me many years, Hattie. Thank you though. All right, so we're gonna have Mob Individual come up next. Mob Individual, mashup of mob and individual, is a solo musician attempting to be a noise orchestra. Using an electric guitar, foot pedals, and several amplifiers, Mob Individual has built a name for himself over the years with a sound built on densely layered and heavily mingled guitar noise. His aesthetic is distinctively left of center and abstract, residing within a wall of sound shoegaze universe that isn't easily categorized or penetrated by the mainstream listener. Please welcome Mob Individual.